Welcome to the Cool Science Seminar at Lamar Senior Activity Center. Today's topic is prescription drugs. Are we overdosed? You can find a lot of books by many authors saying that Americans are taking too much medicine overall, and we're paying too much money for it. There are two books by Dr. Jerry Avorn of Harvard Medical School that I read, which I think are very, very excellent. And so I'm going to do this seminar mostly as a review of those two books. He's dedicated his career to two main goals. One is that he wants doctors to know what's the best medicine to prescribe for each patient. And the second is he wants everybody to be able to afford the medicines that they need. He says we have some truly wonderful life-saving drugs available. And then we have a lot of other drugs that are very expensive and they're not really all that great. Well, here are the two goals that I mentioned before. He wants doctors to know which drugs to prescribe, because every prescription drug comes with a label, which is a long document. And it's really hard for doctors to read all this stuff about all the drugs they could possibly prescribe. Somebody who works in a very narrow field might be able to do it, but for sure the general physicians, just don't have time to read all that. And so the pharmaceutical salespeople try to help them out by telling them that the most expensive drugs are the best. That's not always true. And then there's the problem of getting access to drugs, because some of them are just so expensive. Why do we have these issues? He says there are too many drugs, there's too little oversight by both the Patent Office and the FDA, because they don't have the funding to do what we would really like for them to do. Did that miss it? No, it didn't. Okay, how many drugs are there? The World Health Organization said there are 4,000 essential medicines. Google says the total number of small molecule drugs is about 13,000. Again, that's an awful lot for any doctor to have to try to keep up with. Now, who pays for drug research? Well, the pharmaceutical companies always say, oh, we're paying so much money for drug research that's why we have to charge these high prices. Well, actually, the taxpayers and philanthropies also pay for hundreds of billions of dollars of basic research. And what happens most of the time is that universities do the first steps of the research process to find out what's the mechanism of the disease and what molecules would have a chance of being effective drugs. After something shows promise, then the pharmaceutical companies pick it up and then take it on to develop it. So these are two different stages. What's done by the taxpayers and by the philanthropies is very important work, but we don't get any credit for that in the price of the drug. The pharmaceuticals spend about 10% of their revenue on drug development. The rest is mostly on marketing and patent manipulation. However, they get 100% of the patent rights, so they get all the profits. How much do drugs cost? There's some that cost $1 million per dose, and quite a few that are over $100,000. Now, how does the doctor know which drugs to prescribe? Well, as I mentioned, there's a long list of information about the drugs that the doctor can read, but it's hard to keep up with it. So the pharmaceutical companies provide representatives to go tell the doctors, oh, here's what you should be prescribing. They're not exactly unbiased. So why so expensive? Well, to start with, each of America's top drugs is protected by an average of 74 different patents. Generic versions of America's top-selling drugs were available in Europe an average of 8 years before they're available in the U.S. So we're we're paying a lot of extra money, compared to the rest of the world. And that, let's see, that delay accounted for just a huge amount of extra expense to Americans. Okay, examples of what I think is patent abuse. Does anybody remember commercials for the purple pill?
Yeah.
Okay, the first was Prilosec. That was introduced in 1989. And then when the patent ran out, the company introduced Nexium. And all these purple pill ads just changed from Prilosec to Nexium. Okay, Nexium is exactly the same as Prilosec, except that Prilosec comes in molecules, they're called enantiomers. They're like the left and right-handed form. The company decided to isolate the left-handed form. They called it it's like an ES in front of the name. Now, according to Dr. Avorn, these two are clinically equivalent. They do the same thing. Now, if you want to check when you get heartburn, both of these are available over the counter now. And in fact, I think they're both generic, so they're pretty cheap. You can try them out and see if you find any difference. Apparently, they work about the same because they're both still on the market. Anytime you find a drug that starts with ES, like escitalopram or something, it's probably one of those drugs that's just the left-handed form. And so you can probably find the regular version cheaper. And an exception, of course, is estrogen and its compounds. Okay, another way to abuse the patent system. Claritin was introduced in 1993. So let me see if I can get this to full screen so I can see it better. Oops, no, I can't. Well, Claritin was introduced a long time ago, and then as soon as you digest it, metabolize it, it goes to the liver and it's converted to something called desloratadine. So then there's the Clarinex, which is the metabolic product.
I'll go back to it later.
It's a lot harder than you think it is. But I'll try. We may end up going to the beginning, but I'll try.
Okay.
Oh, okay, here we go. Here we go.
Okay.
Let's look at it closer. Okay, loratadine is Claritin, introduced in 1993, and then the desloratadine was introduced in 2001. It does exactly the same thing, but that costs about $9.51 per pill, whereas you can get generic Claritin for about 14 cents per pill. Now the Clarinex is a prescription only right now. I have read a few comments that people like the Clarinex better, but most of the time people think a prescription drug is more effective than something over the counter. So it's kind of a placebo effect that they expect something better. Okay, so those are two examples. There are many, many more things that can be done to get more patent life out of what is basically the same chemistry. Okay, regulation by the FDA. I still hear people say the FDA is so tough; they make it so hard to get new drugs. They're really they're meanies up there. Well, I think that was pretty much true in the 1950s when thalidomide was used in Europe, and I'm sure most of you have seen pictures of the thalidomide babies that are born with arms and legs missing. Some of them had an internal organ damage, and then there were also a lot of miscarriages. During this time period, the FDA never approved thalidomide for use in the United States because they didn't have enough safety data on it. So fortunately, we escaped a lot of the disasters that happened elsewhere. Now currently, thalidomide is used to treat some conditions, but just not morning sickness for pregnancy. Well, things changed during the 80s. Because what happened? Well, we had an AIDS epidemic, And there were an awful lot of AIDS patients who felt that they had absolutely no chance of survival unless they had some kind of drugs. So they didn't care whether the drug was safe. They didn't care, what were the chances of being effective. They thought if it has any chance, we want it now. We want it because that'll save our lives. So the FDA developed a new process for accelerated approval of drugs. They said, okay, the old standard was that you have to do the clinical trials to prove that the drug gives some benefit to the patient. It can either cure the disease, in the best case, or at least it makes them live longer or gives them some, better quality of life. For the accelerated approval, they said, well, if you can show an improvement on a lab test that indicates it's probably doing some good, then you get the sort of conditional approval. And then the manufacturers still had a responsibility to continue doing the tests after this accelerated approval to show that it did actually do some good for the patients. Well, quite a few, according to Dr. Avorn, quite a few of the manufacturers just never got around to doing these other tests. So this was kind of like opening the floodgates for the pharmaceutical manufacturers to put a lot of new drugs on the market. So let's think about how long should it take to test a drug. You've probably heard about the tests for citrus fruit curing scurvy. That was in the 1700s. I found a paper, you see the reference here to the medical journals. This is recent. It was very interesting. I always heard this story like the British found out that citrus juice, would cure scurvy, but it took them 50 years before they actually started putting limes on the ships for the sailors. Well, it turns out to be actually more complicated than that. The doctor who did the experiments had some very complicated theory of digestion, and he wrote up his results in a series of 3 books. And I've read this list of the 7 different treatments that he tried. He took sailors fresh off the boat who all were very sick with scurvy, and he tried all these different things. He had 2 sailors to try each treatment. I thought, well, how did he pick this stuff? Well, I guess that was part of his complicated theory. So he wrote up his results in a series of 3 books that were very hard to understand. So it took a long time for somebody to dig through. They found, oh look, he gave them oranges and lemons and it cured scurvy. In fact, the results were that within 6 days, one of the sailors was completely well, and then the other one who got the citrus fruit was at least improved enough that he could help take care of the others. None of the other treatments worked. So here, he had the answer. It just took a while for it to reach the population that it could help. Now you see, we understand scurvy today as being a vitamin deficiency disease. When you give the people the vitamins, it cures it right away. It doesn't take a long time. Antibiotics are in many cases a kind of a miracle treatment. The typical course of treatment with antibiotics is like 7 to 14 days. Now, back before the introduction of antibiotics, also we had other problems like, public sanitation was not very good. And bacterial infections used to be all the major killers. Like the top 10 were pretty much bacterial infections. So if you can imagine going back in time and getting the placebo group and then the antibiotic group, if you see that all the people in the placebo group died and all the people in the antibiotic group got well, you don't need a real huge trial. I found a little picture of 4 people. So, well, 4 people will be enough. But the drug is really a miracle cure, and it's worth a lot of money or worth a lot of something. Then you don't need a very long, expensive test with hundreds of millions of dollars to treat all these patients. But modern drugs usually have some very expensive trials, and the drug companies are telling the truth when they say, hey, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this trial. But sometimes that's what it takes to show the difference between the drug and the placebo. This is not good because it indicates that the drug is doing just a little bit better than the placebo. So more expensive does not always mean it's better. Sometimes it does, but not always. Now the requirements for FDA approval is that the drug has to make a statistically significant change in something related to the disease and to be considered safe. So now what the statistical significance is, there can be only, so you got your drug group and your placebo group, there can be only a 5% chance that the difference was due to random chance. So again, this is not, it's not really a tough requirement, and that's the reason we have a lot of drugs on the market. And also, Dr. Avorn complained that statistical significance does not always mean clinical significance. If you can show very significantly that a drug lowers your cholesterol by 1 unit, then it passes the test for approval. But it's really not going to do any good for your health. So results of accelerated approval in the 80s, a lot more drugs on the market. So the insurance companies started the managed care plans with formularies. And they said, hey, we're not going to pay, $10 for a pill when one that costs 10 cents does just as much good. So they started making these formularies, and the pharmaceutical companies kind of retaliated by advertising to the public. Now I used to think, oh gee, the regulations about advertising have been loosened up, and so now they can advertise. There never was any regulation against pharmaceutical companies advertising to the public. They just weren't doing it because it was so expensive. But once they found, oh hey, we can patent all these new drugs and market them, then it was worth the money to try to get people to demand that their insurance companies cover them. Okay, here's just one example of something that Dr. Avorn thinks was a big problem. Vioxx. Does anybody remember seeing Vioxx advertised?
No, I do.
Yeah, Vioxx and Celebrex were two similar drugs. I remember the Celebrex. I don't remember much about Vioxx. But anyway, it was on the market from 1999 to 2004. It's a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, so similar to aspirin, ibuprofen, and a lot of these others. It has a somewhat lower risk of causing ulcers and stomach bleeding compared to aspirin. However, it causes heart attacks, and that's kind of a big price to pay for that. I never have been able to find like how much was less risk, for the ulcers and how much risk for heart attack to compare them. But heart attacks are pretty bad, so this eventually got taken off the market. Now for the background of Vioxx, the steroidal anti-inflammatories are kind of the big guns. That's like cortisone. And then the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories are things like aspirin, ibuprofen, and Vioxx and Celebrex. Celebrex is still on the market. I was surprised to find that out, but apparently, even though it's very similar to Vioxx, it doesn't cause that many heart attacks. And then Dr. Avorn made another comment that a very small hospital in Hong Kong said, well, let's try giving people, a generic non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, one that causes the stomach bleeding, with just another drug to protect the stomach, and they found out, hey, that came out at least as good as Vioxx or Celebrex, and these are both generics, so you didn't need to spend that much money on the new thing. Okay, drugs rarely get removed from the market. I'm not sure why. For instance, you may have heard about Sudafed. Sudafed it's sort of a problem because the meth dealers they used to buy a lot of Sudafed, like, hundreds of boxes, everything they could get their hands on, and convert it in their chemistry labs to the methamphetamine. So you can still buy the original Sudafed, but it's behind the counter. So you have to go ask the pharmacist for the original Sudafed and show your ID, and they're probably not going to sell you 100 boxes. you get some reasonable amount. Well, phenylephrine was substituted for it into the new formula for Sudafed. However, a number of this would be maybe possible to convert to methamphetamine, but it would be much harder, so it's not practical. It's just that.
Question.
Yeah.
You say it said on there that it doesn't do anything for congestion, but they sell it for congestion.
Exactly. Yeah. The question was, does phenylephrine do anything for congestion? Well, no. Actually, a number of studies show that it doesn't do anything for nasal congestion. It has some similar effects, like in different applications. So the manufacturers thought, oh yeah, it sounds like it'll be a good nasal decongestion. Unfortunately, when it was tested over several years, it was found that it really doesn't do anything. And so the FDA has suggested removing it, but it's still on the market.
I still have a question. So is there any way it's harmful? I actually go get it off from behind the counter. So is there side effects?
Well, every drug has side effects.
Yeah.
The phenylephrine is relatively benign. It doesn't cause heart attacks or anything.
Right. Well, the reason I go and get it on purpose is because it seems to be less harm to me than the other sinus medications. The other sinus medications seem to be so harsh and has side effects and gives me headaches and other things, where this is milder. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I can tell you a story of my own.
Okay.
I caught a cold, and it got a couple of weeks before I was going on a cruise. Well, it got better, so I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to be okay. Maybe I'll get away from the Austin allergies, and everything will be okay. Well, I got down to Galveston. Oh no, it was even worse. So I got on the ship and went to the ship's medical department. I said, oh man, I've got sinus problems and got a cough, and this is messing up my vacation. So the doctor gave me some antibiotics plus 3 over-the-counter medicines.
Okay.
So I took them as directed for about the first day and a half. I was so sick, I actually threw up.
Oh my goodness.
And I just said, I'd rather have the cough and congestion. I know there's a lot of things, my grandmother always told me, I'm allergic to antihistamines. I thought, that's ridiculous, how could you? But sure enough, when I take antihistamines, I feel like crap. So there's a lot of individual variations into what works for you. And even if you do a clinical trial and something is not statistically significant that it works,
Right.
it still may give you some benefit because it's an active molecule. It's doing something.
Right. And I
Again.
think it's more milder than what they have out on the shelves. I
Yeah.
could be wrong, but.
Again, I think it's a very individual thing, and
Yeah.
I hope somebody's doing some drug research on something that's an effective nasal decongestant that doesn't have any of these issues like methamphetamine or or throwing up or whatever.
All right, thank you.
Okay, a few more drug issues. The obvious answer is not always the correct one. This is a chart of heart disease versus age for men and women. So the women are in kind of pink or red, and the men are in blue. Now, as everybody gets older, we get more at risk for heart disease. For younger women, or for younger people, men have more heart attacks than women. We've always heard that. But when you get up to like above 70 or 80, the women catch up and even have possibly a few more heart attacks than men. So why do you think that might be? What do you think would be the cause of young women having not so many, being protected from heart disease?
That's kind of weird, huh? So,
Well, estrogen came out, some years back, I think about the time I was born, as a birth control pill. And then doctors figured out, oh, it also is great for treating hot flashes around menopause. So they started giving women hormone replacement therapy. And they said, this will probably protect you from heart disease, so you should be on this for your life, forever.
huh.
And there were several epidemiological studies done where the researchers went and found, women who were taking, say around the age of 60, 70, whatever, women who were taking estrogen versus women who were not taking estrogen. And the ones who were taking it did actually have fewer heart attacks. So they said, oh, that's great. Now, the standard for approval of a drug for specific purpose is the placebo-controlled double-blind experiment. So if the pharmaceutical companies wanted to advertise that estrogen prevents heart attack, what they should do is, get a group and randomly assign them to get either estrogen or placebo and see who has more heart attacks. Well, they never wanted to pay for that study because the doctors were already prescribing it. They were selling the drugs, no problem. This went on for quite a while. And then finally, the federal government decided to fund the double-blind placebo-controlled study of estrogen for preventing heart disease. And 2 studies showed that the estrogen group actually had more heart attacks.
Huh.
And Dr. Avorn said, those epidemiological studies, they certainly tried to match the women who took estrogen and the women who didn't. But it's hard to match them exactly if you don't randomize them. The ones who took estrogen probably had more money because they could afford to go to the doctor, and they were more concerned about their health in general because they believed that taking estrogen was going to protect them from heart disease, so that's what they did. Now, it's not a huge difference, but the estrogen does also increase the risk of breast cancer. That's kind of been known from the beginning. So if it causes breast cancer and it slightly increases the rate of heart disease, then it's really not a good idea to take it for life. And I can remember also a few decades ago, I was reading somewhere that the pharmaceutical industry said, oh, everybody over the age of 50 should have hormone replacement therapy. We've got estrogen for women and testosterone for men, and this is a fountain of youth. But it really didn't work out that way. And as we can think about it just a little more, children don't have a lot of estrogen or testosterone, and they're pretty youthful. So we always need to check these things. Biochemical systems are complicated enough that you can't just look at something like this and say, estrogen is the answer. And then we have the all-hat results. This is, antihypertensive and lipid-lowering treatment to prevent heart attack trial. This was another trial about heart disease. There's a lot of different drugs on the market for lowering blood pressure and also cholesterol. Now, the results of the trial were kind of inconclusive on the cholesterol. What they wanted to see was, are the newer, more expensive drugs better than the older, cheaper ones? And the answer was no. No, the old reliable ones are at least just as good. Also, here's an interesting story I came across a while back. Drugs are not the only route to miracle cures. In 2000, there was an article in the medical journals where a woman had a very aggressive form of lung cancer. It was not something that could be operated on because it was too spread out. And she tried chemotherapy, and it didn't work for her. So she refused further treatment. She went on a cruise, and she said she met somebody who told her to take germanium sesquioxide. That's available as a nutritional supplement. Well, she took a bunch of it, and she felt a whole lot better. So she went back to her doctor and said, hey, I feel great. And he took x-rays and found, darn, it had totally cleared out the cancer. So he said, well, we can't rule out a spontaneous cure, but this is such an aggressive cancer that we really need to look further into the germanium sesquioxide. It was tried in several trials. Some of the chemotherapy agents, like cisplatin, are a little bit similar. They're metal organic compounds. But unfortunately, the germanium sesquioxide never worked for anybody else. So it's still just a nutritional supplement and considered, kind of fringe medicine. But it did work, or at least maybe it was just coincidence that she recovered. So to protecting yourself, I would say get serious about the lifestyle factors, because you really can't depend on miracle drugs. As for generics when they're available, partly because they cost a lot less, and also they've stood the test of time. Anything like that, Vioxx causing heart attacks, that will come out in the first few years the drug is on the market. But after it's been around for 20 years, probably that kind of thing has been eliminated. And then don't expect miracles from expensive drugs. So thank you for listening.
There's a couple things.